Hello and welcome to Bookshook. I am Seema Chishti. We're in conversation today with two scholars I have the greatest respect for, Rohit and Ornit Shani. Their new book, Assembling India's Constitution, is out this month. They're joining us from New Haven in the United States. Thank you, Rohit and Ornit, for being here with us. Professor Rohit is Associate Professor of History at Yale University and an author. Professor Ornit Shani is Associate Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Haifa and an author. Both have books that were almost prequels to this book, if I was to use Hollywood's franchisee language. But on a more serious note, they're actually pre-stories. Ornit's book on citizenship and the making of universal franchise, and Rohit's book, A People's Constitution. This book describes itself as a new democratic history of the Constitution of India, and as someone who has read it, it is that and much more. The Indian Constitution is a living, breathing document so woven into our history and our day-to-day politics too, that no amount of examining it is enough or overdoing it. Interest in it has only increased. It is marking its 75th birthday this year. And in Ornit and Rohit's book, they focus on all the fuel, ideas, and juice from outside the assembly debates that made the Constitution, or at least cast a long shadow or shone a bright stream of light on it. Let's get on with it. So my first question to both of you is if the Constitution should be spelt with a capital C or a small c. You clearly haven't done that. It's a small c thing, but did you think about this?
That's a great question. So perhaps I can tell you, we can say a little bit about sort of where our sense of the Constitution was coming from. There is a tendency, not just in India but elsewhere, to think of constitutions as sort of monumental, as monuments, as something that is arriving at a moment of founding. And with any monument, it's seen as something that there is it's grand, it's imposing. But also a sense that, if the monument collapses, that there was something wrong with the foundation or there was one severe attack on it. I think what we noticed was that when Indians invoke the Constitution, it's not an invoking of like necessarily particular clauses or particular phrases. It's a kind of invoking of the constitutional spirit, a general sense of this is what the Constitution holds. And we even saw this in the protests against the Citizenships Act, where the invoking was of the preamble. So our take of the Constitution is something that is more pluralistic. And the analogy we use is that of assembling. So if we kind of think of a structure that is assembled, in some ways it's not as imposing as a monumental structure, but it means that it can perhaps survive with minor changes here and there. There are some critical changes that make it collapse, but by and large you can add another wing or add some wheels or take away a portion. And it's also one that can be contributed to over time. It doesn't have to be fixed at a particular moment. So I think the broader idea is that there is a broader, more pluralistic constitutional culture that is beyond the text or the kind of imposing edifice of the Constitution.
So Ornit, does that mean small c is good?
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead with what you.
No, I just said that. So small c kind of works, right?
Yes, I was, again, thanks for this question. I mean, no, to be honest, we didn't think about it. And so thanks for pushing us to think. To add to what Rohit said and to leave it as a C symbolically is because the whole point of the book is to show that the significance of the work we've done of this new history is to show that we foreground the process of the making of the Constitution over the text. And if anything, what we're showing how diverse Indian publics from across the subcontinent and even beyond it turned the Constitution into an open site of struggle through their engagement with the Constitution throughout the process of its making. And by doing so, I mean, they basically owned the Constitution, but also turned it into a text that, from their perspective, was open to change, open to ongoing struggles. And we, of course, see it with what you said in your introductory comments about the amount of amendments of the Indian Constitution. So from that perspective, it's not a text that people revere to, and it cannot be a sacred text that cannot change. It's a living, as you said yourself, it's a living constitution through that process.
So my second question is also still about, I'm still skating on the periphery. Is assembling the constitution a pun? Is it the assembly, the assembling?
In many ways, in many ways, assembling reflects a few things. It reflects the whole. It reflects. It's conceptually. Rohit already referred to it, right? Like as a contrast to the notion of founding, where we have a founding. Like the founding of constitutions, as they're usually referred to elsewhere, not just in India. In India, it's the Constituent Assembly in Delhi. And the move we did, and Rohit talked about the concept, right? It's not a monumental thing. It's not something that was happening. We found out that it happened beyond the Constituent Assembly, across India. There were many assemblies. The public that was engaging with the constitution were not simply engaging as stray individuals or even like just stray small groups. They were assembling together to discuss it. They had public discussions. Some organizations put committees to discuss the constitution and later the draft constitution. And on that basis, they send their suggestion to the Constituent Assembly in Delhi more than once. Sometimes they even sent delegations to Delhi. So the act of assembling was the mode of engagement, part of the mode of engagement of the public with the Constituent Assembly. And sometimes it was assemblies like in tribal areas of 20,000 people, 100,000 people. So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, assembling was also a method, our method of working. In order to construct and recover this history, we had to assemble many pieces of documents from many places, from different archives. Also, the two of us, right? The whole way of us starting to write this book. It's not something Rohit and me ever planned or imagined that we're going to do. It was a result of us understanding after we wrote Rohit's A People's Constitution and I, How India Became Democratic. And you've been having a lot of conversation because our previous books very much converse with each other. And then we realized that we're thinking that we found materials about the Constitution and the public engagement with it, that this is going to be our next project. And we think alike. But what we also found out is that, for example, Rohit has some files that I don't have, but I have some files and he doesn't have. In some cases, it was the same file, part one he had, part two I had. And sometimes, for example, in cases of the princely states, some of the materials we had to collect in the British Library, some in the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, some in the National Archive to put it together. So assembling was also a method of work and Right?
If I could just add, I think we're also trying to suggest different ways of understanding the Constituent Assembly itself. So, India is unusual in that it has an assembly that has a certain degree of representation. And it's also clear that, maybe until 15 years ago, it's not that the assembly debates were sort of being read and widely circulated the way they are now. I think the debates are significant. They're kind of repositories of ideas, but there's a tendency to read these debates as a kind of closed, enclosed space. So even it leads to two things. One is that it leads to an overemphasis on individual brilliance. So, one figure stands for liberalism, one for caste inequality, one against caste inequality. And the sense is always that it's the benevolence of these leaders and not, and it's something that the wider public was unaware of or disinterested in. I think what we show, and it's interesting because even Granville Austin talks about it, that much of the work of the assembly itself was happening outside of the assembly floor, but he never then mentions what that work was. The assembly members, most of them drew on many years of political and social activism, and they're in conversation with multiple other groups, both inside and outside the assembly. So at a crude level, there are lobbies inside the assembly, but at a much broader level, these are people who are traveling. So the assembly is officially in force for almost 3 years, but effectively they're meeting in Delhi for about a year in that time. So when they're not sitting in that hall, what are they doing? Who they're talking to? And in the book, we look at the vantage point of at least two of the members, and we see they're tying into very different worlds. So Hansa Mehta, for example, is traveling to the UN, is part of the making of the post-World War II human rights order. But also in India, she's at the All India Women's Conference. She's speaking in sort of zananas and women's spaces. Whereas the other figure, Maulana Hasrat Mohani, is dramatically different. Is sort of working in refugee camps, walking through riot-torn streets, also showing up in an occasional mushaira. And all of this feeds into what they say in the assembly as well. So it's trying to think of
Yeah.
even the assembly
Yeah.
as something that is deeply connected to politics and society
Yeah.
outside.
No, but I'll come to that. I'll come to that particular chapter because which I think is a tour de force in your book, a truly interesting and a riveting chapter. But there's the one bit of the Constitution which actually has "we the people" is the preamble. That doesn't seem to find much attention in your book, if at all. Could you reflect very briefly on why was it important to start the preamble with "we the people"? I mean, would you have any insights on that, or how the people maybe fed into that?
In part, this is work that I think a number of other scholars have looked at. I can think of Akash Singh Rathore and Neera Chandok most recently. And in some ways, the language was, well, there is a language of sort of continuity where the American Constitution and many other constitutions invoke the name of the people. I think it's also quite clear. I mean, the preamble is significant. There are other constitutions at the time that do not have preambles. If you think of sort of Sri Lanka or Malaysia or other British colonies, the preamble is seen as something that connects this text to a larger sort of sense of mobilization. And the kind of intricate sort of behind the doors discussion on how the preamble is written sort of links back to the Karachi Congress of 1931, of other mobilizations that happen. There's a kind of shadow of someone like M.N. Roy in the writing of the preamble. Ambedkar plays a really critical role in emphasizing fraternity in the preamble. So there is a story, but that's a story of sort of political leaders trying to solidify a sense of what they had been a part of in this document. And for Nehru, for example, in some ways, the preamble and the objectives are more important than the actual text. He often says, if the text needs to be changed, we'll change it as long as this broad direction is maintained. So it's seen as something that attaches this formalistic text to a larger kind of movement. But in our readings, we don't see the preamble circulating significantly widely. The preamble is still something that is being written in the assembly, as opposed to the kind of other narratives that we found outside in the public.
Yeah.
Ornit, the fact that there are so many strands of opinions that you discuss, and in fact, it was a revelation for me that there's so much of thoughtful constitutional making happening in princely states. Manipur, and its current politics it's really, it's so ironic, and all that was happening in Manipur then and now, in the Garo areas, what was happening. Do you think the Constitution of India could have been more peoply had it paid a little more attention to the people and to these parallel efforts? Or, I mean, if I was just to just shoot that question at you, what would your response be 75 years on that?
Can you reiterate the question? Do I think that the Constitution...
Yeah, do you think that it could have absorbed more from the parallel processes, that perhaps while all this was going on, not much attention was paid to that?
Right. So, you're right. Indeed, I mean, what we're showing on the one hand is this wealth of ideas, of constitutional ideas, people really, especially in the princely states, in tribal areas, of engaging with constitutional ideas, putting that as proposals, putting that as demands. And many of the demands and the wants of people are not heeded to, right? So it's not that a lot of it was taken on. Many demands were simply ignored. There are some instances where people came up with ideas that were actually ultimately the things that ended up being part of the text. For example, like the language question, right? India's official language, the question of English, etc. But to your question, so I want to take it from two perspectives. One, as far as the princely states are concerned, the fact is that many parts from the constitutions of the princely states actually found their place in the Indian constitution, but we don't see any reminiscence of that today. In the constitution that the assembly adopted in November 1949, the original idea was that many of the constitutions of the state will become a part of the Indian constitution. There'll be the last part will be a collection of all the states' constitution. But what happens in the very final stages, really October 49, is that parts from the state constitutions are entering into the the Indian constitution that is adopted by the assembly in November 49. But today we only can see asterisks because most of these were cancelled by the 1970s. But thinking about tribal areas, for example, and when you look at the kind of demands the tribal groups were putting before the assemblies, likely less blood would have been shed if the assembly would have been more attentive to some of the demands of tribal groups for more, who saw themselves as actually running themselves as democratic communities, who most of the tribal groups in tribal areas didn't imagine themselves as separate units from India. They imagined themselves as they were groups that were claiming self-determination or autonomy within an Indian federation. The Garos, for example, were imagining themselves as being an autonomous unit within Assam that would be within a three-tier federation of India at the time. So they wanted to be part of India, but have control over the way they're running their lives. When you read the tribal people were the one who had the most direct conversations with the Constituent Assembly, because there was a committee of the Assembly that came to the tribal areas, both the territories that would be covered by the fifth schedule and the sixth schedule. And these committees were, traveling around and having conversations with the representatives of the tribes. And when you hear what they're wanting for themselves, they wanting to control. They wanted help with money, but they wanted to control, to make sure that they have schools, they have healthcare, they have development. So my answer would be yes, that likely if there would be a bit more attentiveness, perhaps tribal areas would have integrated in a better way from the outset, because what we're seeing is because, in fact, the final constitutional arrangement for the administration of tribal territories and people is such that was, from their perspective, worse than what the 1935 Act gave them, because the fifth and sixth schedules left the governor quite a lot of discretionary power and took the autonomy of tribes within their council. It led to struggles, some of them, violent insurgencies. So, it's not that we're thinking in terms of counterfactuals and we don't know what would have been, but if you ask me like that, likely. Right? Do you want to add to that?
I think the only thing to add is that it was interesting that the assembly members, were conscious of democratic sort of demands inside British India. But when it came to the princely states, they sort of preferred to deal with the princes. So there are a number of princely states, the eastern Odisha states, Manipur is an example, where the princes say, well, look, I've already transferred power to my assembly. Or, in Manipur, we have universal adult suffrage, there are going to be elections. So you can't ask me to decide, I can't make a decision whether what form our government should take or what I should sign independently. I need to kind of go back to and talk to my sort of democratic community. And the States Ministry sort of sees this as a delaying tactic, realizes it's easier to engage with the ruler than with the, whatever the people of the state might want. And that becomes, what initially began as a much more consultative process became a more closed process. In part, why it doesn't become a long-term problem is that, as Ornit's second book shows, there is a institution of adult suffrage in the 50s in most of the former princely states, turning them into kind of a democratic referendum on this. And similarly, even with the consultation of the tribes, when the leaders of the tribes sort of meet assembly members or send deputations, they keep saying, well, we can't speak for our tribe. We need to go back and talk to our community and then tell you what they actually think. But the process is such that it doesn't allow for all of these multiple conversations. The idea is, if you're a representative, you just say, we take you to be the representative. There's no sort of continuing conversation there.
Can I just add, because you referred to Manipur at the beginning of your question, and indeed Manipur is a section in the book because of, we talk about the integration of the states in a new way. We talk about how the state integrated through a constitutional process, basically. But Manipur is somewhat a tragic case of having a constitution that functioned, that ran already elections on the basis of adult franchise, before India was finishing implementing even universal franchise, a constitution that didn't have emergency clauses, and a constitution that actually, according to the High Court judgment of Gawati Roy, correct me if I'm wrong, still actually, as long as it doesn't contradict the Indian constitution, it still exists. And people who already had the full right to vote and had elections in 1948 were taking these rights. Their legislative assembly was cancelled. And the long trajectories of that, perhaps some of them is in what we're seeing today.
So now there is this renewed interest in the Constitution. It is the stuff of memes. It has been on T-shirts, the preamble, ever since 2019, 2020. It suddenly came into its own. It's part of posters. The slim red book, that particular edition of the Constitution, has almost become totem-like. What does this interest of the people in the Constitution, 75 years on now, say about the Constitution of India? Would you be worried looking at politics now? Or does it speak of the health of Indian democracy, that the Constitution is so integral to basically a whole kind of politics that is at play now?
So it's been quite dramatic, the kind of public emergence of the Constitution. There are a couple of things. People sort of think of this as new, as something that is novel. And I think what we want to suggest that this is actually tying into an older relationship that people had with the text and with the Constitution. And it was an imagination of a kind of compact that, while people might be appealing to it from their own social locations, was framed in terms of a kind of universal good or public reason. So you could make demands as a Hindu or as a trade unionist, but the sense was that these are not just demands of our community; their way of imagining society. I think for a very long time there was and this is a process of, I think, in many countries when you have electoral, at least have electoral democracy, there is a sense that the business of governance or interpreting the Constitution is to be left to courts and to lesser extent legislatures. And I think at a point of time when people find that courts, bureaucrats, and politicians are perhaps not being the most effective interpreters of the Constitution, that there is a need to make this public interpretation more visible. So I think that's part of the process that is happening. It's happened in other places, other countries as well, around specific issues. But what I think is interesting in India is that the invocation is again not to Article 19(1)(a) or Article 25. It really is to the preamble, which interestingly promises things like economic and social justice ahead of political sort of justice. It emphasizes fraternity, and there is something Kalpana Kandabiran writes about it beautifully, about the act of reading the preamble in public together, sort of crafting a certain kind of social capital around it, but also saying that we are the interpreters of the Constitution. It's not an exclusive business of elites. And what we're trying to show is that this actually was what was happening in 1946 as well, where there were public assemblies where people were discussing clauses, translating clauses, sort of thinking about the document. And in the process, even if the document didn't give them what they want, it forges a relationship and a kind of possibility of change in the future. It kind of creates it's almost familiar relationship that even if we haven't got what we wanted now, we feel entitled to claim this later on.
Yeah. So the one truly sumptuous chapter is the theatre of the assembly, when you focus on 4 individuals. And I just want to get into a little bit into that. There is, for instance, now a big debate, almost fraught, on ascribing authorship to the Indian Constitution. And currently it's being framed as B.N. Rao versus B.R. Ambedkar. So, and this is something that Sanjay Hegde, also wrote about, senior advocate of the Supreme Court, about, how it's completely wrong to do that. So where do you stand on this business of appropriation in order to ascribe authorship? Does the fact of so many people's involvement in the Constitution also, in your view, dilute the need for this debate? Or will we have to keep confronting this question every couple of years, depending on politics and its unfolding?
I mean, in many ways, I think what we're showing in the book suggests that it's a wrong question, almost. It's a wrong question because despite the fact it's a wrong question, if I'll go into it, I mean, It's, the secretary of the Constituent Assembly, Mukherjee, he was the one who drafted the initial clauses, right? There were people there were so many people who were busy with the minutiae of the draft. Of course, Ambedkar had huge role in drafting the Constitution, and B.N. Rao wrote the first draft of the Constitution. But in fact, one of the most significant things that we show in the book is the way in which the Indian public, and diverse publics from across the territory, right, not just specific groups, gained ownership over the Constitution and saw the Constitution as theirs constitution. And then the question of ownership is, in a way, it's kind of, it foregrounds the question of authorship, because even if when I think about it, you think about the First Amendment, right? So a few months after the Constitution comes into force, it's being amended, and it's being amended quite significantly. And at that point of time, what you see is the public response to the question of amendment is the public wants to be part of this process as well. Either they want to see the draft that what the government wants to amend, to see it in order to comment on that, or they see it as an opportunity some groups see it as an opportunity to maybe amend other clauses in the amendment and send their ideas. And then I deliberately talk about what happens immediately after the enactment of the Constitution to show that the public, and Rohit referred to that just earlier, the public saw itself as not just the recipients of this Constitution, but as something that is there. They have the right to interpret it. They have a say in it. They make demands over it. I think Rohit's book, A People's Constitution, shows it beautifully. We show how it came to be. So I think maybe we should think more about ownership rather than authorship.
And if I can just, Seema, if I could just add, I think this debate about who wrote the Constitution is essentially a kind of false flag operation. The entire attempt there is to attack Ambedkar. And in a way, it comes out of a deep sense of discomfiture that one of the main things the Constitution does is it promises a society that breaks down the hierarchies of caste and untouchability. So there have been attacks on Ambedkar right from the moment of writing the Constitution, and the kind of invocation of Rao as the kind of alternative Brahmin figure. Many people who do that have read neither Ambedkar nor Rao. So Rao, for example, was involved in sort of temple entry legislation back in the day. It's not Rao's constitution because Rao at certain points feels that fundamental principles should be not allowed to override, fundamental rights should not be allowed to override directive principles. So he thinks the social and economic program should overturn sort of civil liberties. Ambedkar in some ways is perhaps more concerned about civil liberties and individual rights than Rao is. I think what we also show, and Ambedkar's role is critical at several moments. For example, when he sort of drafts the clause on fraternity, or he refuses, he threatens to leave the assembly if the provisions on affirmative action are not passed through. But I think what we also show is that these are not ideas that are only emanating from Ambedkar. So Ambedkar's ideas are supported and engaged with a much larger sense of Dalit mobilization. So initially, the Cabinet Mission Plan does not provide representation for Dalit communities inside the assembly. In fact, they don't have a seat at the table. And the Scheduled Caste Federation, which Ambedkar was leader of, was standing outside Congress offices courting arrest. Many were, in fact, arrested. There's also much that is made of differences between sort of different politically aligned groups, but all the scheduled caste members of the assembly and the scheduled tribe members of the assembly got together. They had their own mini assembly and a common charter of demands. So Ambedkar was being backed even by figures like Muniswamy Pillai and others who were Congress members, because there was a shared sense that outside of party identity, this constitution had this kind of radical promise to break out of the caste order. And I think forensic studies are all interesting, but I would like to the debate is not framed out of curiosity or kind of intellectual interest. It's a very partisan debate trying to attack Ambedkar and the promise of equality the Constitution has.
Yeah. So these two other characters you pick in this book, Hansa Mehta and Hasrat Mohani. Hasrat Mohani has not even signed, his signature is not there, something you describe in great detail. Why pick these two characters from a 243-member assembly, with each character was, as colorful as it gets and probably as crucial. What drew you to them?
Let me start with Hansa Mehta, and you'll talk about.
Yeah, you can take Hasrat Mohani.
So Hansa Mehta it was very. I'll say something else first. I mean, we took these two characters, but we do believe from a lot we looked at that in fact, if we would have done this forensic little, covering these 3 years in their lives during the time between December 46 and November 49, we would have found similar things in relation to most members of the Constituent Assembly, right? Their lives beyond the assembly that had to do with constitution making. But when you look at the Constituent Assembly debates, Hansa Mehta appears 3 times. At the beginning of the debate, she says something. She said something at the very end of the debates, and then she appears when she just gives the flag, hands the flag to Nehru on Independence Day. So if you'd only focus on the Constituent Assembly debates, as most of the work on the making of India's constitution has done, you think that she was there, but she didn't do much. But once you follow Hansa Mehta, as we did, outside, beyond the assembly, and what she has been doing over these 3 years of debates, where, as Rohit mentioned again, out of 3 years, actually the assembly sat in Constitution Hall only for 1 year out of these 3 years. So when you look at her life beyond, you see that her little room residence in Delhi became a place where the women members of the assembly would come and have informal conversations to make decisions, to recommend who should go to which committee, etc. She was dealing with the whole 3 years. She was just doing non-stop constitution making in India and abroad, in committees of the Constituent Assembly, that was working throughout the time, in important committees, right? She was part of the Advisory Committee, Fundamental Rights Committee, the Provincial Committee. She was in a number of committees, but she also worked in the UN, on the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And then, so she worked abroad. But a lot of the work shows, there is a lot of work, Manu Bhagwan and others, about her work in the UN. But what we're finding out is that these international constitution-making processes, she takes them back to India. And in India, it engenders constitution-making, constitutional discussions among groups that we don't see if we look just at the assembly. Like, for example, 10 governmental ministries that come together to discuss how those international treaties or covenants going to affect the constitution, etc. She's Rohit, you already mentioned it, actually, going around the country, speaking to women in zananas in other places. So the idea was to take someone that, we wanted to have one of the women, but also someone who, when you look at the debates, you can't see much work on constitution making, but she was a big constitution maker for India. And Mohani is a bit of a different story. Rohit, do you want?
Yeah, but Mohani also, a lot of the green rooming that he did, I mean, he did a lot of action in the green room. Go on, Rohit.
So I think we use the metaphor of the theater to sort of suggest that what we do see when we just read the debates is this kind of production and a script. And we want to pay attention to what actors do when they're off the stage or who's preparing things outside. And the conventional narrative has always been about these main players, what Granville Austin calls the oligarchy. There may be 6 or 7 people who are seen to be either on the assembly floor or behind the scenes, the most influential. There are also some people who have signed the constitution who, like Y.S. Parmar from Himachal, who arrives at the assembly a few hours before the constitution is finalized, right? So, when there's this common list of 15 women or 16 women who are in the assembly, but 3 or 4 of these sort of never take their seat. So we wanted to find people who were sort of participating throughout, but have not been sort of conventional subjects of study. They also are interesting contrasts. So in some ways, Hansa Mehta is an insider-outsider. So she's a woman. She's sort of linked to the All India Women's Conference. She at various points of time takes a kind of stance against the government. But she's also married to the sort of former premier of Bombay. She has been a congresswoman for many years, has deep relationships with the Congress leadership. Mohani, who I think we had known about him, but I think reading him and engaging with him was a revelation. I think he's the only person in India who was simultaneously member of the Congress, the Muslim League, his own Azad Muslim Party, the Communist Party of India, the Progressive Writers Movement, and the Jamaat-e Ulema-e Hind. And in every single site that he was part of, he was a dissenter and he was more radical than the organization. So he, in fact, makes a demand for Purna Swaraj, I think in 1921.
Well before.
Gandhi actually opposes it. He is, surprises everyone in the Progressive Writers Conference by sort of saying that, well, obscenity can be poetic and aesthetic. In the Communist Party, he sort of tells them off by sort of neglecting religion. And in the Muslim League, he defies Jinnah and says, who are you to sort of negotiate for all of us? And he has a kind of very strong sense of what the constitution would look like. So what is interesting, in contrast to Hansa Mehta, Mohani talks all the time. He's all over the assembly. You can see he's exasperating his colleagues. He talks all the time. He rarely gets any kind of traction in what he's saying. He refuses to sign the constitution. There are three members who don't sign on principles. His is the only voice heard shouting no, no. But then he lines up and goes and takes a photo with everyone else, right? So that itself, I think, is interesting that, I don't sign the text, but I see myself as part of the process. And I see myself as part of India's polity. And I see this as a collaborative exercise. So I think there are other scholars, particularly scholars who worked on sort of Urdu poetry, who've written about him. But his kind of political vision was really revelatory.
And to think that he gave us Inqilab Zindabad, I mean, that the slogan, so which also qualifies him immediately for special focus. So there's been this is my last question, but I'd like both of you to reflect on this very misplaced focus that the Constitution is colonial. Definitely your perspective, the details you unearth, nails that, buries that. So grateful for that. You write in your conclusion, and I'll read a little bit, which I want you to elaborate on, both of you or either of you. The focus on the text and the Constituent Assembly debates led scholars to suggest that much of the language and functions included in the Constitution were inherited from the Government of India Act 1935, implying a continuity with the colonial state. Indeed, a mere textual comparison would suggest that about two-thirds of constitutional text was adopted from the Government of India Act 1935. The constitutional politics beyond the Constituent Assembly, however, suggests that even a text that looks identical can be misleading. How so? Could you take our viewers through that even if the text is similar, why is a conclusion that it is a Xerox in large part of 1935, why is that so misleading?
I want to sort of also begin with sort of addressing this kind of colonial argument. It has sort of two genealogies. I think one is coming from voices that are critical of some aspects of the Constitution. They would say that it doesn't give enough for civil liberties, doesn't do enough for redistribution. The second, and I think that seems to be circulating more today, is a kind of critique of inauthenticity, that these ideas, be these ideas of equality or justice, are really sort of European ideas or ideas of certain elites. It's in a vocabulary that is not understood by the large majority of the people. So I think that what we show is that actually every group in this period of time, whether it's sort of, Orthodox Hindu priests or sort of trade unionists, were engaging in the language not as a foreign language, but as a language they were very comfortable in, and a language in which they could express their kind of particular demands as well. It was a process of much wider engagement than is imagined. And even the members in the assembly, they might belong to elites, but they're all part of larger political and social movements. So it's a bit of a straw man to sort of use this colonial constitution. It's also interesting to me that whenever people say, oh, this is colonial, they don't usually spell out what their vision of the decolonial constitution is. And we saw a few glimpses. So there were an All India Dharma Samiti, which was trying to argue for an orthodox Hindu constitution, but that suggested that we should not be directly independent. There should be a chamber of princes where they would govern. Religious communities should be governed by religious law. Untouchability for ritual purposes would be preserved. These are not arguments that many of the kind of critiques of colonial constitution are even able to make in the public today. Secondly, the critique about the constitution not meeting the demands of civil liberties and redistribution were being made in this period, and in many cases, these demands led to social movements that led to parts of the constitution transforming the future. So let's take the example of right to food. Right in 1946, there were people saying, "What does it mean to have a constitution without the right to food?" And sort of imagining the constitution, even the existing texts, that this should entitle people to sort of access to nutrition and food. And it's while the Supreme Court and Narega and all happened only about a couple of decades ago, the seeds for this of imagining this right in the constitution are right there from the beginning. I mean, me briefly say something about the text, and then Ornit, perhaps you could come in. So I think the text is firstly, the first misleading thing is Ambedkar and B.N. Rao both say it, is that, there's no such thing as a completely original document. We are making sovereign choices to borrow what we think is best. And what we think is best could be in the Government of India Act of 1935, which was something that many of the people who were involved in the political movement were aware of in terms of phasing, etc. Secondly, there are some superficial resemblances. So, for example, the powers given to the governor. So in the colonial period, the governor was usually a appointee of the colonial government who would have excessive power over the only level of elected government at the provinces. A critique of the governor's powers was seen as this is about a colonial government versus a local governor. There was lots of debate about how the governor would be selected in the assembly, but the idea was that the governor would be someone who is Indian and very much tied to the democratic party structure, and the sense was that the governor's role would be more limited than what the 1935 Act governor was. That it's taken a different trajectory over time has more to do with how politics has evolved than with the text in itself.
Just to add a few things to what Rohit said in relation to your question. I spoke earlier about the sense of ownership that the public gains over the Constitution. So, we see in many of the letters that are being sent, people are using, both individuals and groups, are using the phrase, "for our Constitution to be truly democratic." This is our Constitution, and we want to identify the defects before it's too late. So the phrasing "our Constitution," "this is our Constitution," is iterative in many of the letters and claims that we're seeing. So the public perceived of the Constitution as being their own. And in fact, it's very interesting that in 1944, just late 1944, when most of the Congress leadership is in jail across the country, the British government is coming out with a huge campaign to interest the Indian public in the Constitution. And they invest a lot of money in a campaign over the radio, and they invite political scientists and other people to give lectures about the Constitution, and competitions among students to write essays about the Constitution. They wanted to interest the public in a Constitution, but in a kind of non-political way. But there was no interest. I mean, they invested a lot, and they concluded it by saying it didn't put the Gangas on fire, right? Like, they were very upset about how it didn't succeed. And within months later, when the Constituent Assembly, just when the public knows that the Indian Constituent Assembly is about to convene in Delhi, there's huge fire of letters coming to the assemblies with demands. There's huge interest. So the Indian public saw it as something that was very political. As we show in the book, all the engagement of the public with the constitution making was inherently linked to the lived experiences at the time, to the context of the life when it was. So in so many ways, they saw the Constitution was an abstract text for them. It was something that they could own because they took part. They saw themselves as they can't be passive participants. It's theirs. And therefore, their engagement and the process of seeing it as their own. And I think that the kind of protest that you mentioned at the beginning of our talk, with people holding this little red book of the Constitution, that I think the significance of that moment politically was indeed to say this is our constitution. So the fact that you feel that this constitution belongs to you, and that was done in the recent election, in the face of the threat that if the government will get a huge majority, they might change the constitution in a significant way, and that was a way to defend the constitution. The constitution was a bestseller, and people held it already in February 1948, and we talk about it in the book about as soon as
it was priced at 1 rupee, I think, the draft, yeah. So just thank you so much. I mean, thank you so much, Dr. Rohit Dey, Dr. Ornit Shani, for bridging text, context, and people so beautifully in assembling India's constitution. And I hope everybody who can gets their hands on this. And along with the little book, the little red book, this teal and cream book makes for an excellent read. Thank you so much for joining us from New Haven on a coldish morning. And thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.